Thank you so much for being with us today. It's been fantastic, like in the first section, so hopefully I'm going to live up to that. So my name is Orion, and I'm here to talk about love. And I know the program says something about fandom and shame and whatnot, but bear with me. So to begin with, I would like to tell a love story from a very good friend of mine, who a few years back was at a Renaissance fair with a few friends of his. Lovely summer day, they were all sampling the local cider, having a really good time, and having really nice casual conversation. Then the conversation drifted towards a man named Smith. Some people knew him, some people didn't, but the thing is that he is very important to my friend. And he's a soldier. He's an officer serving in the army. And around the time of that conversation, he had lost a limb on his service. And during the middle of that lovely, lovely day, my friend began to cry, talking about it. Because to him, he was more than just any other person. He was a mentor figure. He was a role model. I had never had the opportunity to even tell him. So my friend began to cry, and his own friends patted him on the back and started laughing, because Mr. Smith is a fictional character from a TV show. So they were like, yeah, no, it's fine, you're gonna be fine. None of them really understood. He was really embarrassed. And I've heard a lot of stories like that over the years from fans, because we all know what fans are. You know, we know what fans do. We've heard stories of this, that, and the other, from people who are passionate about different pieces of media. We've heard stories about women fainting in front of the Beatles. We've heard stories about people queuing for hours outside a convention center to attend a science fiction convention. We've heard stories about people spending months recreating the costume of their favorite characters so they can impersonate them for a short amount of time. We've heard stories about people owning a separate room to house all their memorabilia and merchandise. So we know who the fans are. We know what fandom is in one way or another. And you will notice that I'm actually putting together fiction fandom and celebrity fandom in this. Because, I mean, after all, when it comes to celebrity, we don't really know who these people are as humans. We know their stage personas, we know the fiction around them. So, we might even identify as fans ourselves in that regard. I know I certainly do. As a matter of fact, if you do recognize which Mr. Smith I was talking about earlier, do come and talk to me on the break, because I have so much to say about that series, and I've cried so much about him when he lost his arm. So yeah, absolutely, do come and talk to me about it so I can pour my heart out. But see, that's the sort of thing that I would not normally be bringing up as a piece of conversation, say at a dinner party or a more ordinary conference. Because there is a sense of shame attached to that. And all fans feel it to some extent. So what we do a lot of the time is that when we do talk about fandom, we tend to draw a line somewhere between what is and isn't weird. And Terry Pratchett himself went on record saying, fans are great, fandom is weird. So we do draw a line arbitrarily about where we think that weird is, and we step outside of that. I go like, oh yeah, I'm a great fan of this thing, but I'm not like these guys. It's like, yeah, I write fan fiction, but it's like, you know, it's not porn. I go to conventions, but I don't cosplay. I cosplay, but not in a fursuit, you know. I watch the show for the plot, okay? Because we understand we understand instinctively that there is a social transgression involved in this. Because the first rule of fandom is that you don't talk about fandom. And my friend very much knew this. He knew that he wasn't meant to be talking about this. It wasn't intended. You know, they just had one too many cups of cider and, you know, emotion just poured out. It just happened. And he knew that boys are not meant to cry. not in public, not in their late 20s, not about a fictional character. And that invisible transgression has a lot to do with how we perceive emotion and passion in general. So the difference between me, the difference between, say, an ordinary fan and somebody in my place is that I can hide behind my PhD and say, I'm not an ordinary fan, I am a professional fan. I'm a fan scholar, I read fan fiction professionally. And what happens is that when I do introduce myself and my work like that, people still see that invisible line wherever they might be placing it in their own head. And they imagine me somewhere around here, observing it all from a distance, probably in a snazzy lab coat of some sort, and be like, yes, fursuits, splendid. Carry on, guinea pigs, do the cosplay. Oh yeah, of course I know what I'm talking about. Trust me, I'm a doctoral candidate. That couldn't be further from the truth. I'm like, right here. But the thing is, the reason why this is excusable, and other forms of this might not be, is because we see value in that distance. We don't praise people for indulging emotion. We praise people for controlling it. Because in that distance, we see intelligence. In our ability to remove ourselves from emotion, we see maturity. And all these concerns and all these perceptions of weirdness are rooted in this idea that fans have a problem being so close to their passion, being potentially consumed by it, being stunted emotionally, unable to grow up. And the one thing I discovered, or one of the first things I discovered in my studies, is that these concerns are not new. All these anxieties around fandom and what fiction can do to you are not new. If we could go back to the Victorian era, because a lot of us tend to think that fandom started with Star Trek in the 70s, that's not true. So if we go back to the Victorian era, there was a real concern in Britain about middle-class women's mental health, because they were reading too many novels alone. At a time where reading was not meant to be a solitary activity for women, and the most appropriate kind of reading was scripture. So reading alone was a borderline scandalous thing, because God knows what's in these stories, and women's constitution was considered too sensitive. They were too vulnerable to the effects of fiction. And we got imagery from that time depicting women reading alone a book, with their hands beneath their skirts. And if you're drawing a parallel at this point with how we perceive female readers of fan fiction today, you would be on the right trail. So women were thought to be reading with their bodies, while men were reading with their minds. The interesting thing about this is that, as history proved, neither was really immune to the effects of fiction. Neither was immune to being seduced away by stories. So, as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's biographer, Mr. Carr, wrote, when Sherlock Holmes died, or more accurately, when his author killed him off because he was sick of him, young men went to work, publicly mourning the character, with black crepe bands around their arms and on their hats. The Queen Victoria herself was reportedly not amused at that development. Doyle's own mother felt the need to tell him off for killing lovely Mr. Holmes. To this day, we have a plaque in Switzerland commemorating the exact place and the date where Holmes and Professor Moriarty fought to the death. Do I need to remind everyone these are fictional characters? And all of this happened around about the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. So way before Star Trek. But we can go even further than that. Because this fear, this anxiety goes even further back. Don Quixote or Don Quixote, depending on how you want to pronounce his name, is a literary character who was invented in the 17th century. And you might remember him as the man who gave away dignity and respectability to pursue being a knight after reading one too many novels about knights, and deluding himself completely, thinking he was something that he was not, fighting windmills, thinking they're giants, being followed by a squire on a donkey, all very heroic. He was getting into all sorts of embarrassing situations. And as a piece of literature, this represents a number of things, but amongst them, there is a parody and an exact manifestation of that fear that being immersed in fiction too much can literally drive a person insane. Now, you might be thinking at this point, well, you know, I don't think fans are insane. I think they're quite well-adjusted people, a bit weird, but well-adjusted people. You know, I don't think there's anything pathological about them. I just think that fandom is a bit useless, uncreative, trivial. Because after all, what is it that fans do if not playing somebody else's backyard? Taking art that doesn't belong to them and fragmenting it and stitching it back together and remixing it in ways that are not always savory. But the thing is, if we go even further back in history, this is not new either. There was another thing I discovered. So if we think back to a time before writing was the main means of communication, where storytelling was the way we educated ourselves and each other. And storytelling was primarily oral. Now, to aid memory, minstrels at the time would use stock characters and stock plots and stock wordings and phrasings. Originality was not a concern. And there was no single author for any story. The idea of the single author, the owner of a story, is modern. We're talking about a time where stories essentially belonged to everyone, and everyone was writing them together. Each retelling was writing the story. And if we consider a contemporary creator, like, say, Walt Disney, whose company still claims ownership over a large number of things and is claiming that ownership very, very aggressively. Did they invent Snow White, The Little Mermaid? You're probably thinking, no, these things go back to the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, etc. But the latter ones did not make these stories either. They recorded them. So they're storytellers, not authors. And the reason we think about authors now is because we've come to a point where we're thinking that stories can really be owned and can be bought and can be sold and can become products. But that hasn't always been the case. And we might deride fans for not being original. But when we look at these stories, can we deride them for not being original? Does it even matter? I mean, when you look at something like Hamlet from Shakespeare, that was not an original story. That is a pretty late retelling of a story, the origins of which are sort of lost in the sands of time, potentially going into Indo-European roots. But we can't even tell for certain it's that old. When you look at the Iliad and the Odyssey, they're attributed to Homer, but we're almost certain that he did not make these stories. So all these people can claim ownership of is that particular telling of something that is much, much older than them. And what mattered with these was not this notion of creating something from the void, but what the story actually was. How it taught people empathy, how it taught them to understand themselves and each other. Because this is what storytelling was about. This is what storytelling arguably still is about. It's a reflection of humanity. It's a reflection that comes back to us larger than life. And this reflection might not always be pretty, you know. It can be ugly, it can be disturbing, it can be very self-indulgent. And indulgence is something that we do accuse fans of quite a lot. We laugh at people who write themselves as a Star Trek character. And Star Trek is my favorite example for everything, by the way. But if we look at the great poet Dante from the 14th century, he wrote a grand epic about himself, his own favorite poet, and his childhood sweetheart, exploring the entirety of the biblical afterlife together on this big, big adventure, and meeting God in person. Now, we might be finding this amusing, or any other number of things, but I think there's something really moving about it. Because when I look at something like this, I have no doubt that this man had a very close relationship with the idea of God, that he loved God and was very eager to meet him. The same way my friend would very much love to meet Mr. Smith and tell me how much he has acted as a mentor to him. The same way I would love to have tea with Princess Zelda and talk politics. The way we would all love to meet our own literary heroes, however they might have helped us, whoever they might be. Because at the root of fandom, in the end, and the root of all storytelling, arguably, there is learning and a passion for learning, and a passion for relating to each other, but there's also love and wonderment, and that childish desire within everyone to make that wonderment last. Thank you very much.